Hello guys, welcome to another video on TV Nancy. This is another episode of the reading of the podcast of The Sinking of the Bismarck, The Deadly Hunt by William Fuller. Okay, so Chapter 9, An 11th Hour Turn of Fortune. Aboard the Bismarck, toward the end of a stormy day, Admiral Lutyens and his staff were waiting hopefully for the dark of night to arrive. The German fleet commander had known since 10:30 in the morning that he had been found again. At 11:54, he had radioed Naval Group West. Enemy aircraft shadowing, land plane. Approximate position, 4840 north, 2000 west. This was 600 miles from Brest, his destination. A little later, he reported that a wheeled plane was circling him. From German intelligence furnished him from shore, he knew what that meant. It meant that enemy Force H, with the battlecruiser Renown and the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, was near. The news had an ominous sound to naval headquarters in Berlin. This marked, said the official German naval report later, the beginning of the unfortunate developments. Still, to those aboard the Bismarck, it had not been a bad day. Though British carrier planes had maintained contact throughout the afternoon, none of them had launched a torpedo attack. Admiral Lutyens had expected none, but it had not come. He had no idea that the Ark Royal Swordfish had attacked their own ship. It was now past 7 p.m. on May 26th. Evening was almost upon them. 2 more hours of dwindling daylight, and the Bismarck would be safe. The planes from the enemy carrier, which were still hovering about, could not keep up their watch after dark. A British cruiser had been spotted on the horizon at 5:40 p.m., but Admiral Lutyens thought it probably could be shaken during the night. At dawn, it would be all over. The Bismarck would be under the cover of the mighty Luftwaffe. The Admiral had already received a radio message from Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, Chief of the German Air Force. It said that the Reich Marshal had ordered the mobilization of every German airplane available in Western Europe. They would provide protection to the Bismarck on her way into Brest, and U-boats and destroyers would help. In another 24 hours or so, Admiral Lutyens' daring mission would be successfully completed. Although he had not succeeded in the original aim of destroying British merchant shipping, he and his gallant crew would certainly be hailed in Germany for having sunk Britain's greatest warship, the Hood, with no loss to themselves, and they would be congratulated for having, after their great victory, eluded most of the ships in the British Navy and got safely back to port. And in fact, according to his dispatches, Admiral Lutyens' staff worry at twilight was his fuel supply. It was getting low. At 7:03 p.m., he therefore signaled home, "Fuel station urgent. When can I expect fuel?" Probably this message was designed more to stir up Naval Group West than to get oil. For enough, Group West replied that it was sending out the tanker Ermland to refuel him during the night. The fleet commander knew that the ship could never get through the British, nor could he afford to stop to take on oil. He had enough fuel to make Brest at 20 knots. He merely wanted to arouse naval command ashore. It had been signaling for him for 24 hours that help in the form of Luftwaffe bombers, U-boat, and destroyers was on the way. None had materialized that he could see. Like most German naval officers, Admiral Lutyens resented the fact that Hitler and Göring had not given the German Navy a fleet air arm such as the British had. The drowning of 2 planes from the Ark Royal just out of gun range was a reminder of him of how useful carrier planes were to the enemy. Still, though the British had known his position since before noon, and their carrier could not be far away, They had done nothing about it. They had refrained from attacking it all the long afternoon. Now they had only an hour or so more of waning daylight in which to try. Perhaps the weather was too bad, the visibility too low, the waves too high to mount an air attack from a carrier. Luck had been with the Germans in so far as the weather was concerned. But even if the British planes did come through the last minute, what damage could they do? The light torpedoes which the antiquated little swordfish biplanes carried could scarcely penetrate the heavy anti-torpedo armor of the Bismarck. It had been built to withstand the heavier torpedoes of surface ships. Admiral Lutyens was not duly downhearted as he stood on the bridge of the Bismarck about 8:30 that evening. He was scanning the eastern skies for the coming night that would preserve his ship and his victory. And then the antiquated little enemy planes appeared. The air raid alarm sounded throughout the battleship. A voice blared through the loudspeakers. "All hands to action stations!" From the lookouts came cries, "Plane on the starboard bow! Plane on the port beam! Plane on the starboard quarter!" The old-fashioned swordfish, one of the few types of biplanes still being used in combat, were swarming in from all directions. The Bismarck's guns roared into action, puncturing the sky with the bursts of their shells. Admiral Lutyens hastily got off an urgent radio message to shore. 2054, 8:54 p.m. Am attacked by carrier-borne aircraft. On the Ark Royal, as daylight started to fade, the crew was working feverishly to get off the second and final strike against the Bismarck. All hands knew that it was the last chance. The fiasco of the attack on the cruiser Sheffield had at least revealed one vital piece of information to the carrier's commander. Captain Larcom, restraining his feelings about having nearly sunk by the Ark Royal's planes, radioed over to Captain Mound that most of the torpedoes launched by the Swordfish had exploded on hitting the water. In fact, that saved the Sheffield from disaster. Captain Mound on the Ark Royal concluded at once that the new magnetic pistols on his aerial torpedoes would have to be discarded. He ordered them replaced by the old-fashioned contact pistols. These went off only when they hit a solid object. In the high waves, torpedoes tended to dive lower than they were set to go. They often went under a ship. Theoretically, a magnetic torpedo, even when it slid under a ship, would explode because of its nearness to the steel of a vessel's hull. That was why Captain Mound had used them in the first attack. For some reason, most of them had gone off on hitting the water. He had therefore decided to try the old contact pattern. To guard against their diving harmlessly under the Bismarck, he set the torpedoes for a diving depth of only 10 feet. He made sure this time that the Swordfish would not mistake the Sheffield for the Bismarck. The pilots were told to fly over the cruiser first and then go onto the enemy ship. The Sheffield, having by this time sighted the Bismarck, was shadowing her just at the gun range. She could therefore direct the flyers straight to the target. This was a great help, as the Germans ultimately realized. In a secret official German naval report written afterward, Admiral Kurt Asman emphasized that this was of particular importance for the further course of action, since the Sheffield was now in the position to direct the torpedo aircraft in an attack on the Bismarck. Actually, despite this help, the British flyers found it very difficult to locate the enemy in the murky weather. A northwest wind was blowing with almost gale force. The clouds were down to 600 feet above the churning sea. Getting the planes off the carrier for the final attack had proved most difficult. The Ark Royal was pitching even more dangerously than during the previous takeoff. But a few minutes after 7 p.m., 15 swordfish, all that were left, got safely off the lurching flight deck and headed for contact with the Sheffield. They knew that everything depended on them. If they failed this time to hit and drastically slow up the Bismarck, she would make her haven at Brest. The planes reached the Sheffield 40 minutes later and were told by signal that the Bismarck lay 12 miles dead ahead. In 8 or 9 minutes, the attack would be launched. Observers on the cruiser listened for the sound of firing from the Bismarck's guns. 10 minutes passed, 15 minutes, 30 minutes. The silence was ominous. What had happened to the planes? They had got lost in the clouds. At the end of half an hour, they were back over the Sheffield asking for a fresh bearing. The Bismarck, as they were told, was still just 12 miles directly ahead. The plane swerved off for another track. Soon the watchers on the cruiser had heard the roar of anti-aircraft fire from the Bismarck. Now and then, a clear patch in the mist revealed the flashes of her guns and the burst of the shells in the air. At last, the Swordfish had found their target and were attacking. It was hard going. So thick was the cloud cover, it rose from a few hundred feet above the sea to 10,000 feet, that the British planes could not hold formation for the sweep down at the German battleship. They soon split up. To make matters worse, their wings began to ice up while they were in the clouds. The only recourse was for each pilot to get down and attack as best he could. The result was that they flew in from every direction to launch their torpedoes. This had one advantage, of course. It dispersed the German fire. Even so, the anti-aircraft fire, as the airmen found soon, was quite deadly. At least 5 planes are soon hit, though they managed to keep going. All but one of the 15 Swordfish launched their torpedoes at short range in the teeth of the heavy flak barrage. Did they score any hits? It was difficult to see in the smoke of battle and in the mist and gathering night. The last plane did not launch its torpedo until 9:25. Night was falling. Apparently, there had been no hits. At least there was what the squadron leader ruefully reported by radio to his carrier, which in turn flashed the mournful news to Admiral Tovey on the King George V. Estimate no hits. That signal from the squadron leader was the last bitter straw for the commander-in-chief of the home fleet. There was nothing for him to do now but admit failure and turn home. It would be of no use to try to catch the Bismarck during the night. She had too big a lead on him. The exhausted crews who had been pushing the 2 big battleships Rodney and King George V in a desperate effort to overhaul the Bismarck were informed of the failure. Captain Derry Dimple Hamilton on the Rodney personally took the microphone to inform his crews over the ship's loudspeakers that no hits had been scored by the Swordfish. The chase seemed to be at an end. The spirits of the British aboard the 2 ships were about as black as the night, which had now descended over the wind-swept sea. Then over the radio came a message, which at first merely seemed to confuse the situation. Admiral Tovey could make nothing of it. It was a signal from the Sheffield announcing that the Bismarck had reversed course. Instead of steering southeast for Brest, she was now veering in the opposite direction. To the dispirited Sir John, it made no sense. He knew that sailors often made the mistake of making the course of a distant ship 180 degrees wrong. That is, they thought it was coming toward them when it actually was steaming away from them. Sir John, who invariably kept his temper tightly in check, permitted himself a sarcastic remark at the Sheffields making such a common blunder. And at this, of all moments, the Captain Larcom on the Sheffield had deadly proof that he was right. If he mentioned in his message that the Admiral would have been convinced, but the Captain had neglected to do so. The proof was that shortly before the Swordfish had finished their attack on the Bismarck, the German battleship had turned suddenly on the British ship and opened fire. Before the Sheffield could make smoke and swerve off, one salvo from the enemy ship had fallen so close that the splinters wounded 12 men among the cruiser's anti-aircraft crews. 3 of them were dying. The Bismarck had not, as Captain Larcom expected, turned back on its course to Brest after firing. Instead, it continued to come at him on the opposite course, and he had to scurry to get out of the range and save his ship from being blown up by the enemy's heavy guns. It was clear to Captain Larcom that the Bismarck was in fact sailing directly toward Sir John's 2 battleships to the north. But this at first was not clear to the admiral. He had just dismissed the Sheffield's report with a sarcastic quip when a second message came over the radio about the Bismarck's new course. This is from one of the planes of the Ark Royal, which had remained over the German battleship to see whether any damage had been done in the second torpedo attack. The pilot could not see any damage, but he could plainly see that the Bismarck was heading northwest. Sir John's face lit up. A ship's watch at nearly sea level could mistake the direction of a ship directly ahead, but the plane just above could not. The pilot's confirmation of the Sheffield signal was significant. Still, Sir John refused to be carried away by this good news. If the Bismarck were really, for unaccountable reasons, steering toward him, he would have her before dawn. But he thought the chances that she had merely reversed course as part of an evasive action against the swordfish attack, or she could have done in order to catch the Sheffield and the Wares and finish her off. Then, with the night ahead of him, Admiral Lutyens would shake his shadowers and have clear sailing until daylight brought him his shore-based bomber cover. If Tovey had known of the Bismarck's firing at the Sheffield, this would only have confirmed his judgment. As it was, he was sure that the next message would reveal that the enemy had resumed course for Brest. To Sir John's surprise, and it was a pleasant surprise, the next message did not reveal any such thing. It came 9 minutes later from a spotter plane. It said that Bismarck was still steering northwest. Again, after 9 more minutes, a similar report was received from the aircraft, and then a second came from a second dispatch from Sheffield. The Bismarck, it said, had now veered north. Admiral Tovey's skepticism began to evaporate. It was obvious now that the Bismarck was steering toward him. It made no sense. What could the explanation be? Suddenly it occurred to the admiral that the Ark Royal's planes might have scored a hit after all. If so, it must have been just the lucky one he needed. It must have damaged the Bismarck's rudders. That would explain her erring course. He was now pretty certain that this was what had happened to the Bismarck. Toward midnight, he radioed the rest of the fleet and the Admiralty in London of his new course on the enemy. His plan now was to get to the westward of the Bismarck and attack her at dawn, when she would be silhouetted against the light of daybreak. So confident was Admiral Tovey now, after a week of reverses, that he penned a message to the officers and crew of his flagship. The sinking of the Bismarck might have an effect on the war as a whole out of the proportion to the loss of the enemy to one battleship. May God be with you and grant your victory. About 1 o'clock in the morning, it was now May 27th, Sir John received a message from Vice Admiral Somerville that further increased his confidence. The last of the Ark Royal's planes assigned to keep contact with the Bismarck had returned during the night with a vital piece of information. Its pilot had seen her turn 2 complete circles after the torpedo attack and came to a virtual stop, headed north against the wind. For the British, this was the final piece in the jigsaw puzzle. The mighty Bismarck had been hit in the stern. Her rudders or propellers, or both, had been damaged. She was no longer maneuverable. The chase, which had seemed definitely lost a few hours before, had been nearly won. Admiral Tovey could now take on the Bismarck at any hour he chose. It was a temptation for him to close in at once and try to dispose of the enemy during the night. As soon as he had read the Sheffield's last intelligence, Admiral Tovey changed course to the south to meet the enemy head-on. Shortly after dusk, the Sheffield, following the Bismarck north at a respectable distance, sighted 5 destroyers tossing at high speed through the rough seas. They turned out to be Captain Vian's squadron. Captain Larcom directed them onto the enemy ship just ahead. The last of the little swordfish torpedo planes did not get back to the Ark Royal until after dark. 5 of them were riddled with shrapnel from the Bismarck's flak. One had 175 holes in it. Both the pilot and the gunner were wounded, but they had succeeded in bringing back their crippled craft. They managed to land it on the flight deck, though the ship still pitched and rolled in the storm. The pilots reported to Captain Mount that they were sure they had scored at least one torpedo hit amidships. This information was radioed to the fleet at 10:30 p.m. 10 minutes later, the carrier signaled that the Bismarck's starboard quarter. For some reason, Admiral Tovey did not receive this message until an hour later. He had already turned south, but the message confirmed him in his judgment. Any damage to his ship's quarter might put her rudder and even her propellers out of action. Thank you for watching today's video. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. See you in the next episode. Bye!